안녕하십니까? 카이스트
Good morning,
NYU
everyone.
디지털 거버넌스
Welcome
포럼에
to
오신 것을
KAIST-NYU
환영합니다.
Digital
저는
Governance
오늘
Forum.
사회를 맡은
I am
카이스트 글로벌 전략연구소
Hoon Son,
소장
Director of the
손훈입니다.
Global Strategy Institute of KAIST.
오늘 포럼은 디지털 전환 시기를
Today's
맞아
forum
글로벌 난제를
will
해결하기
be a
위한
venue for
국제 연대의 장을
discussions
만들고
on the ways
디지털
to
거버넌스를
establish
모색하고자
digital governance
카이스트와
in the
NYU가
future.
동시에 준비를
And this
하였습니다.
has been
오늘 포럼은
put together by both KAIST and NYU. And this forum is being live streamed on the YouTube channel. We will have two sessions. In the first session, we will listen to 4 presentations by some of the world's most prestigious scholars. And in the second session, we will have a panel discussion with the speakers. First of all, we will listen to the welcoming remarks from President Kwang Hyung-lee of KAIST. At the moment, President Lee is participating and attending at a presidential meeting, so we have prepared a video clip for his remarks. But at the end of the forum, President Lee will join us at the forum. So please stay with us until the very end of today's event. Then let us watch his video remarks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kwang Hyung-lee. I'm the president of KAIST. I'm very happy that we are holding this digital governance forum between KAIST and NYU, where we'll be looking into new designs for the future and a new government framework for the digital ecosystem commensurate to the digital transformation era. So this 4IR and the digital is exerting a lot of impact on our lives, and it's leading a lot of changes in our industry and technology. And so the digital is exerting a huge influence, and so it's important that we set up a system whereby everyone is able to evenly benefit from the digital and be able to use those systems without discrimination. But the digital innovation technology, while it brings economic and industrial convenience, is also exacerbating the digital divide and also leading to new social conflicts. In order to alleviate the conflict, we need fairness, growth, solidarity, and freedom. And with those values, we need to set up a digital system and social institutions. We need a very new kind of social order and also change society. The Republic of Korea seeks to lead the digital era, and together with the international community, we seek to share these values and also to contribute to expanding the freedom of digital technology and also to realize the universal values of the humanity. In that sense, I think it's very meaningful that we are having this forum between KAIST and NYU. The KAIST and the NYU is providing a joint campus and is leading cross-border innovative cooperation with joint research and education startups. The two universities which are leading the world in order to set up a digital-free civil society will exert joint effort, and I think it's really fortunate that we are having this kind of collaboration. The digital is going to connect everything and is going to limitlessly expand everything, and it goes beyond all limitations in terms of time and space. But the digital's influence is also expanding towards the politics, economics, society, and culture. And so the digital has to be open for everyone and the benefits shared by everyone. This forum brings together academics from the sciences, technology, humanities, and social sciences, and various stakeholders will come together in our society to talk about a new governance framework and also about visions for a new future digital cooperation. Through this forum, I hope that we'll be able to share a variety of different perspectives and be able to share those values across the borders so that we'll be able to set up a digital ecosystem that forges solidarity and it's in the interest of the entire humanity. In setting up the new digital order, based on ethical universal values while accommodating the digital changes, many governments and businesses and civil societies around the world will come together. And we believe that social economic values and also the expansion of liberties through the digital technology based on consensus and international efforts are very much needed. We also need to forge an equitable society based on digital democracy and liberal civil society where there is no inequalities and digital divide. Last but not least, I would like to thank everyone for participating in KAIST-NYU Digital Governance Forum, and I'd like to thank everyone for their effort in putting the forum together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Lee. Next, we will listen to the welcoming remarks from the President of NYU, Andrew Hamilton.
Good morning. I'm Andrew Hamilton, President of New York University. I am delighted to be joining President Lee and all of you from New York City at this first KAIST-NYU event held in Seoul. Welcome to everyone joining us at today's forum. NYU is thrilled by the partnership that we are embarking upon with KAIST. New York University has been committed to global engagement for over a generation. From our students in their studies to our faculty who conduct research through a global lens and our many campuses throughout the world. Our physical presence extends across the globe, from New York to Abu Dhabi and Shanghai, as well as 12 study-away sites on 6 continents. And now it's come full circle. Through the KAIST-NYU partnership, we welcome to New York City one of the world's great universities in science and technology. We've had many exciting and productive conversations with President Lee and his colleagues. These conversations have already led to the identification of 6 major areas of scholarly collaboration. Quite a fruitful and promising start indeed. We are very excited about the future of our partnership. Together, we will develop new ways of thinking and reimagine undergraduate education for 21st century students as they take their place in this increasingly complex and sophisticated world. I've spoken about NYU's long-standing global tradition, one that goes hand in hand with our bedrock commitment to the free movement of people and ideas. This critical concept will be discussed at today's forum through the lens of technology. As data-driven software, AI, and social networks become even more essential parts of our daily lives, I am confident that today's discussions will lead to new and promising insights. Thank you all for being here and participating in this forum. We look forward to the months and the years ahead as we build what I know will be a very productive collaboration.
Thank you very much. Those were some opening words from Mr. Hamilton. And now we're going to go on to the first presentation for today. The first presenter will start off the presentations by 4 prominent experts. We'll be talking about the digital governance. So the first presenter is Dr. Matthew Liao. He's a director of the Center for Bioethics at NYU. Professor Liao, the floor is yours.
You can get started whenever you're ready. Okay?
Okay. So hello, everybody. So let me start by saying what a great honor it is to be here, to be a part of this joint initiative between KAIST and NYU. I was at the launch of the joint NYU KAIST campus in New York City last month, and I know that the NYU community is more than excited about the collaboration between our 2 esteemed institutions. It's clear that a tremendous amount of work and effort went into making this collaboration possible. And speaking for myself as a faculty member, I just want to extend my thanks and my gratitude to President Lee and President Hamilton and to the leadership teams at KAIST and NYU for bringing us together. As President Lee and President Hamilton have said in their keynote speeches, today we're here to explore the global efforts and challenges posed by novel digital technologies. So to start this conversation, I'm going to begin with an overview of some of the key issues in artificial intelligence, AI ethics today. AI, as we know, is becoming more and more capable. Here is Lee Se-do, the 18-time world champion from South Korea, apologies, of the easy to learn but very difficult to master game of Go. And in 2016, Google created AlphaGo, who learned to play Go by playing against itself. It was able to beat Lee Se-do 4 games out of 5, something that experts did not think would happen for a very, very long time. In healthcare, AI has begun to identify some types of cancer better than doctors, diagnose various eye diseases, as well as ophthalmologists. And recently, an AI-generated artwork won first place in an art contest, raising questions about what counts as art. And a few months ago, Blake Lemoine, a software engineer, claimed that Lambda, a Google chat box, was sentient. That is, it has feelings and is self-aware. So as AI technologies continue to advance, questions about the ethics of AI become more and more pressing. So for example, in an emergency, should a self-driving car prioritize the lives of passengers or the lives of pedestrians? Should we as a society allow or ban lethal autonomous weapons that can find and destroy targets without human intervention? What type of governance structure do we need to regulate such technologies? How can we create an AI system that is fair and that does not inadvertently discriminate, like this one, against racial minorities? So my goal today is to come up with an ethical framework that can help us navigate these thorny issues. Now, as we're going to see, it's going to be helpful to distinguish between ethical issues that arise because current AI systems are limited in certain ways, what I call vulnerabilities in machine learning, and ethical issues that arise because AI systems may be working too well, and we humans are vulnerable when they're interacting with these systems, what I call human vulnerabilities. So in his insightful and extraordinary speech that President Yoon gave at NYU, he said, and I quote, at the digital vortex, a new level of digital order is needed in the center of politics, economy, society, and culture. We must realize the universal values of humanity, freedom, human rights, peace, and solidarity. So in this spirit, I shall be articulating a human rights framework for governing the development and use of AI. So let me begin by just saying something about what AI is. I'm sure a lot of people in this room already know what it is. There's no sort of agreed upon definition of AI. We can take it to be getting machines to do things that require thinking, learning, and problem solving. Now, AI can take many forms. One is symbolic AI, which uses a series of if-then statements to establish the relationship between inputs and outputs. Another form is machine learning, which uses algorithms to learn from data without being explicitly programmed to do so. And within machine learning, we can distinguish between supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. Very briefly, supervised learning is when an algorithm is trained on a data set where the correct answers are labeled. Then it applies what it has learned to a different data set. In unsupervised learning, an algorithm aims to sort out the data and find correct answers on its own. In reinforcement learning, an agent attempts to learn through trial and error. The algorithm rewards an agent if it succeeds and punishes it if it fails. And these methods can be combined with deep learning, which uses different layers of modes to detect increasingly abstract features. And deep learning is the main driver for many of the breakthroughs in today's technologies. Now, as impressive as deep machine learning is, it also suffers from a number of limitations, which can give rise to a host of ethical issues. For example, machine learning needs a lot of data to work well. So companies have a strong incentive to harvest or buy data, including sensitive personal data, even when doing so could violate an individual's right to privacy. So an example is when the UK's NHS gave the personal data of about 1.6 million patients to Google to test a novel way of detecting kidney injuries, but they didn't properly tell the patients how their health data will be used. Second, machine learning is only as good as the data from which it learns. If it is trained on inadequate or inaccurate data, then the algorithm will make bad predictions. This is known as the garbage in, garbage out problem. And a lot of problems relating to fairness and bias in AI comes from this garbage in, garbage out problem. So for instance, algorithms trained on gender imbalanced medical imaging data sets have been found to do worse at reading chest x-rays for an underrepresented gender. Third, if an algorithm itself is bad, it's also going to make bad predictions. For instance, an algorithm might identify a pattern even when there isn't one, a problem known as overfitting. Or it may fail to identify a pattern even when there is one, a problem known as underfitting. Fourth, deep learning typically employs thousands or millions of connections that interact with one another in very complex ways. As a result, it's very difficult to interpret what these interactions mean. And this black box nature of deep learning raises questions of explainability and trust. So for example, a deep learning algorithm may tell you that someone is likely to commit another crime, but it wouldn't be able to explain to you why. And since it's a black box, we do not know whether it's saying what it's saying on reasonable and reliable grounds. And given this, it's also difficult to trust such a system. And for high-stake decisions, such as whether to keep someone in jail, not being able to trust a deep learning system is especially worrisome. And in fact, we know that deep neural networks are vulnerable to what's called generative adversarial attacks. So here's one example. This is called a one-pixel attack. So researchers found that by changing just one pixel in an image, just taking a pixel out, they can get an algorithm to classify an image of a ship as a car. And for our purpose, if a deep learning network can be tricked in this way, then issues of explainability and trust remain highly relevant, especially in high-stake domains where human beings could be harmed. So in sum, there are many ways in which a machine learning could fail, and they give rise to many ethical issues. Now, let's consider some ethical issues that can arise because current machine learning systems may be working too well, and we are vulnerable in various ways. So let's give some examples. Facial recognition technologies are getting better and better. On the plus side, they can help us find criminals more quickly and identify children who are missing or kidnapped. On the negative side, a government could use this technology to monitor its citizens or to profile and discriminate against members of a minority group. Now, this is an example where machine learning may be working too well, and ethical issues arise because people may be tempted to use the technology for bad purposes. Second, deepfake videos are coming. Here's one of Tom Cruise. So here, I want to show you the video.
Okay, TikTok, impression time. This is a 5-second impression of a snapping turtle coming out of its shell. Did it mess up my hair? Nope.
So that's not Tom Cruise. That's the guy on the left. But deepfake videos are so good now that in the future, it's going to be even more difficult to detect whether a video is fake. So what if someone uses deepfakes to conduct smear campaigns against politicians and private citizens to spread fake news and erode trust in our already polarized society? Here's a third example. A study from McKinsey predicted by 2030, 30% of human labor could be replaced by automation. How do we help people who will lose their jobs to robots? So when talking about AI ethics today, many people began to think about fairness and bias. And these are important issues, but these issues tend to come up because current AI systems are limited in certain ways. Now, it's important to recognize that there are other ethical issues besides fairness and bias. So take deepfake technologies that we just saw, for example. The concern that they could undermine democracy is more than just about fairness and bias. So to have a more comprehensive and robust ethical framework, I'm now going to sketch very quickly a human rights approach. So elsewhere, I've argued that human beings have what I call human rights to the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life. And very briefly, the fundamental conditions are just very goods, capacities that human beings need in order to, whatever else they might need in order to pursue a good life. So for example, they need food, water, and air. They also need the capacity to think, to choose and act freely. So President Yoon talked about the importance of liberty and freedom, to appreciate the worth of something, to develop interpersonal relationships, and to have the control of the direction of one's life. There are many reasons why we should adopt a human rights framework. First, respecting and promoting human rights is compulsory. It's not something that you can choose not to do. Second, human rights are rights against everybody. So what this means in a governance language is that governments, corporations, individual researchers all have the responsibility to make sure that AI technologies do not violate human rights and in fact promote human rights. So just to give an example, suppose that a user has signed an informed consent form or an end user license agreement, giving us the permission to use the user's personal data. Does this mean that we can do whatever we want with the user's data as long as it's within the terms of the agreement? The human rights perspective suggests that this may not be the case. We may still have the responsibility to make sure that we do not use the user's data in ways that could undermine their human rights. Third, the human rights framework helps us to see which values are in conflict. So take, for example, using facial recognition technologies for mass surveillance. Here we can see that the conflict is between law and order on the one hand and our human right to privacy on the other hand. And the question for us is whether law and order should always trump the right to privacy. And there are reasons to think that that might not always be the case. So for example, say in the future, you can create a biometric device, you can implant a biometric device into somebody that can track that individual's movement. If law and order always trumps the right to privacy, it seems that it would be permissible to require citizens to have such implants. But this seems like an overreach. If so, there are circumstances in which law and order doesn't trump our right to privacy. Fourth, in a number of years, a great number of ethical frameworks have been proposed. Today, there are over 80 such frameworks from private companies, governmental agencies, and so on and so forth. A further advantage of the human rights framework is that it offers a principled and comprehensive approach to grounding some of these principles. So let me just wrap up. Novel AI technologies can be exciting, but they can also raise a number of ethical issues. Whenever we're developing new technologies, we should not just ask whether we can, but also whether we should bring them about. To help us decide this, we need a robust ethical framework to guide us. I propose that the human rights framework can serve as a baseline from which we can make these important decisions that can affect all of our lives. Thank you very much.
예, 리아오 교수님,
Thank you, Professor Liao, for your presentation. So he talked about the issues related to AI and ethics, and he also touched upon how society can exist in harmony with technology. Next, we'll move on to our next presentation, which will be provided by Mr. Jason Alford from the World Bank Group Korea office.
안녕하세요. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you especially to Presidents Lee and Hamilton for their opening remarks and to Professor Lau for his excellent presentation. My name's Jason Alford. I'm the representative of the World Bank Group in Korea. You might wonder why the World Bank, a development institution, is in a high-income country like Korea. The reason we're here is not just for the comfort of my life, but we have a knowledge program working with Korean partners, and Korea's amazing experience of development over the past 60 years. We try to take Korea's experience to other developing countries that we work in, and KAIST is one of our most important partners in doing that. Our program is based around technology and innovation, which of course are things for which Korea is very well known. And congratulations on your partnership with NYU too. That's a very powerful combination. Okay, so let me start to motivate the conversation a little bit. What I'm going to tell you about today is how the World Bank is approaching issues of digital governance and the frameworks that we're using. And we can get into specifics, but maybe in the conversation afterwards if we want to do that. But first, to motivate the conversation, what we're really talking about often in the World Bank is about data. We can talk about digital and governance, but at the heart of it, it's data, it's information that we're talking about. And to give you an example of the power of data for development, it's a very simple example from Odisha state in India. We had a cyclone there in 1999 that went through and with 10,000 fatalities, so a very horrific event. Just, less than 15 years later in 2013, we had a similar sized cyclone go through the same area, and there were 1 million people evacuated, so still a huge event, but only 38 deaths. And the difference here was simply that the Disaster Management Authority in Odisha, with the help of other people, had invested in weather forecasting data, that invested in systems that disseminate the data and the information, and they were able to reduce the fatalities from 10,000 to 38. One simple example, but this for us is the power of information for development. If I can give you a personal reflection on data as well, my career 30 years ago started in the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and back then things were different with data. We had a mainframe computer where we stored our data. That computer was only connected to the power supply and one user at a time. But the issues that we thought about were very similar. We thought about how can we get value out of this data? How can we get good quality data? The rubbish in, rubbish out question. How can we get people to trust us to deal with their data properly? How can we disseminate that data? How can we protect privacy? So very similar issues. Now, of course, we're in a world we talk about digital governance. We're all carrying, I'm sure you all have devices on you, 1 or 2 devices at least, with access to the internet. This is Korea, so many of you have probably got 3 or 4 or 5 devices on you. And I guess that's the difference. It's a difference in scale. The data is now being collected from you all the time. It's now being pushed out to you all the time. So a massive difference from the time of when I started. But in many ways, the fundamental questions are the same. So for the World Bank, the framework we use is we think about how we can take this data and use it for development purposes. So the actors in this that we see are individuals at the top of this framework, civil society, academia. We see government organisations as a player, government and international organisations, the private sector down the bottom. On the left, we have data production and collection. On the right, we have development issues. And what we're doing is taking the useful data from the left through the actors in the middle to use it for development purposes. We can magnify the benefits of data the more connections that we make and the more people we can involve in the system. But as you can see from this chart or this picture, or you can look at it later, each of these connections also, while giving benefits, also produces a point of risk in the system that you need to think about and manage. So this is the framework we're using. And what we've suggested is that we need a social contract for data. So we need to think about how we get that data from the point of origination to the development purpose. And what we're suggesting is that we need a social contract. Our social contract has three elements to it. The bottom left corner there, I'll speak about each of these: value, on the right, equity, and at the top, trust. So we think they're the three critical factors that we need in our social contract. The social contract will, the precise details of it will vary from country to country because country systems are different. But fundamentally, we think we need these three elements to be successful. So let me start with value. Really, for us, this is the key, is because we want the development outcomes, because we want to have impact from the data that we use and the way that we govern it. We want that development value at the end. So we want to be able to use the data for good purposes. So that's the core. And I think all those actors I listed in the system want the same thing. Individuals want this, governments want this, private sector wants this. For each of them, their conception of value is going to be a little bit different, but they want something out of the data that they're generating and using. For us, President Lee's introduction captured this perfectly. He spoke about equity issues. For the World Bank, this is very important for us. For us, our particular concept of equity, of course, is poor countries and people living in extreme poverty. We want them to have access to the benefits that data brings as well. But you can expand equity to think about other aspects of equity, parts of the community that traditionally have trouble discriminated against or have trouble accessing government services and other things. Those people are going to have the same problems in terms of accessing data. So thinking about equity is very important. Equity sounds like it might cost us money, but in some cases, by changing the frame with which we approach the concept of value, I think we can actually get more profits or more benefits out of thinking about equity conditions for data governance rather than just focusing on our traditional frameworks. And that third one, trust. Professor Lau, of course, spoke about in much more detail about aspects of this, but people need to be confident that their data is protected from misuse. They want to avoid discrimination, cybercrime, and those other issues. And again, to make the point, trust feeds back into value. Without trust, we don't get good quality data, we can't get good quality outcomes. So trust is a very important part of this. And what we've proposed is that each country should think about establishing an integrated national data system. As I said, for each country, this will be a little bit different depending on your framework and your culture and what purposes you're using the data for. But the elements of the integrated national data system that we've said we want countries to think about and we would like to work with them on are that production point. So how do we produce the data and what qualities does it have at that production point at the top there? Think about who uses the data in the second point there. The third point, what are the pillars, what are the foundational policies, institutions, infrastructure that we need then to use and manage the data? And what are those foundational issues there at the bottom? And trust is in there, demand for data, funding, those types of issues. Again, to emphasise, we're not proposing one size fits all for each country, but we're proposing this as a framework that countries will need to think about. And to hone in on the data governance point, what we've done is think about that in 4 areas. We're thinking about data infrastructure and policies surrounding that. We're thinking about laws and regulations. We're thinking about economic policies, and we're thinking about the institutions. And there's the 2 sides to this. There's the policies and institutions that allow you to get value from the data, but there's also the ones, sorry, I should have said 3 elements, the equity issues, which will also come out of this, and the trust issues. And the way we approach this is differently from at the national and international level. So that first layer on infrastructure policies, again, we're thinking about the backbone infrastructure that countries need to be able to collect and disseminate data. At the international level, we're thinking about technical standards, regional collaboration. Laws and regulations, we're thinking about safeguards and enablers, cybersecurity issues, interoperability standards internationally. economic policies, traditional data sharing issue of antitrust, of course, trade, taxation, and then at the international level, tax treaties, global trade agreements, and then institutions, government entities, particularly as a regulator, of course, international organisations, cross-border cooperation. So again, these are key points that we want to hit when we talk to developing countries and indeed any country about data governance issues. There have been assessments of how countries are going, and this is probably hard for you to absorb all the detail of this particular one that I'm presenting here right now. So this is from the World Bank Statistical Performance Indicators with some key indicators on what we see as important for data governance issues. You can see I've highlighted here East Asia and the Pacific in a darker colour, and the performance is patchy. If you look at the map and if you drill into this data, perhaps the thing that stands out about East Asia is that performance is quite variable across countries. So you see in the coloured chart there, as you might expect, Japan and Korea performing very well, but then many other countries in our region with a much patchier record on how they're going on these things. Where Europe, higher performance but much more consistency of performance as well. So I think that's something we need to think about in our region in particular, how we take as I said, the learnings from countries like Korea and Japan that are doing well and work with the other countries that need to lift their standards is very important and part of our work here in Korea. This just shows some of the key governance institutions in East Asian countries. Many East Asian countries do have cybersecurity agencies, as you'd expect. Many of them, but not all, have data protection agencies of some sort. But a specific institution thinking about data governance is much more unusual to see in East Asian countries, and that's something that we're working with a lot of countries on to bring together these principles that I've talked about in a more consistent way. So let me summarise from the presentation. Again, emphasising each country is different, and I haven't gone into the specifics of each country, but what we think is each country does need a new social contract if we're to maximise the value from data, built on that issue of what is the value we're trying to get, but also how do we build into the system trust and equity. We still have a long way to go on digital and data governance, and as I said, in East Asia our performance is patchy in particular, and it's something we need to continue to work on to get that systematic approach to data governance. Digital governance is also a matter for international cooperation. Now here we do have to be careful. The more sharing of data and international standardisation you get, the more those risks start to come out in the system and the more controls you need, but also you can share data, maximise the value and get benefits from learning from each country. And we should aspire to that vision nationally of integrated national data systems and use those to link the higher level international cooperation. So let me stop there for now. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alford, for your presentation. So we've listened to the perspectives from the World Bank Group on the importance of data governance. Next presentation will be given by Kyung-yeol Park, Professor of Graduate School of Science and Tech Policy, KAIST.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyung-yeol Park from the KAIST Grad School of Science and Technology Policy. So I'm going to be talking about how technology contributes to the global development, and also I'd like to talk about the database digital governance and what role it plays. So it's really, I'm really happy to be able to participate in this face-to-face forum. Actually, after studying engineering, I went to Tanzania to work as a computer teacher, and then I joined World Bank, and as Mr. Alford had said, I had participated in the World Bank project, so there were some difficulties, but then nonetheless I learned a lot from that World Bank project. So I came to think about why innovation might fail in some certain cases. So when I came back to Korea, I felt that it was not just the problem of the developing world. social consensus is very important, and so various stakeholders have to forge a consensus. That's what I learned. But nonetheless, digital transformation in Korea and globally is a very important part of all areas of our life, from society to the economy and to the global community. But the end of 2022 is a very difficult situation. We are facing climate change and the pandemic, an economic crisis, food crisis, and also the supply chain crisis as well. And so we are facing a very complex kind of crisis, and it has already been 2 years. But ironically, from 2020, we have witnessed the pandemic, but that has actually accelerated the digital transformation as seen through many documents. But as Jason has said, the digital access, if you look at the access, you can see that there is a polarization and exacerbation of the digital divide. And so forging a more inclusive and digital governance is all the more important to be able to accommodate a variety of different stakeholders. And so based on this, we also need to come up with a futuristic kind of governance structure, and that's also related to a new worldview. So science and technology has always developed, and that has also changed society. And in fact, due to the scientific revolution, we have been able to modernize. And so the Renaissance in the West made us realize that we needed to have a more rational and experiential and empirical worldview rather than a metaphysical one. And so why is the digital transformation garnering more attention than other kind of technological change? That's because it's a general purpose technology. As you can see, it's not just a particular state or a particular business that is using the technology. It has a complementarity characteristic. So in other words, it is used in everyday life of individuals and in government policies and in all industries. And even after the end product has been made, the technology does not become closed, but it continues to become applications in our smartphones and also leads to new kind of designs. And so it also has its own technological ecosystem where it further develops. So space navigation and nuclear convergence and genome project and other kind of big science are really important in this kind of national science and technology innovation system. But electronics and electricity and computer, internet and AI are also affected simultaneously. And also when it comes to the targeting of the government policy implementation, the analysis is focusing not just on the large levels like organization, but it has moved down to the institutional level. So for example, the individual. And so that has two implications. The first is that there are many stakeholders, which also means that we need a new governance and collaborative framework going beyond the existing state and organization. And so in order for the survival of the individuals and stakeholders to collaborate, we need something that is very different from the past. We need a robust social normative framework, to borrow the words of Professor Liao. The second thing is that we need to pay attention not just to individual technologies, but to the comprehensive social impact that those technologies may bring. In other words, we need to think about the innovation, economic innovation, but also we have to think about problems like labor coming from the platform labor, and also we also have to think about the possibility of surveillance by authoritarian governments, and we have to think about the openness, but the fact that there's also resistance to new technologies. And there are also ethical issues we need to think about as as well. So, there are algorithm-based decision-making. That some resumes are scanned by AI. And so the government is now having to play a new kind of role as a mediator. Anyway, but the government also has to be preemptively be able to define these technologies and also needs to resolve the new types of conflicts. But it's really difficult to come up with a new governance structure, and that's because of the so-called pacing problem. So the technological change is exponential, but we are always lagging behind. We are always facing the lack of time. So I think how we deal with the pacing problem eventually leads to how we face this pacing problem is actually the core of the digital governance. And so the technology tends to have inertia, and sometimes the time and cost may increase, and that's where the dilemma is. And so we have to really move ahead with setting up the governance structure for the emerging technologies. So where do these pacing problems come from? So they are across all different social classes, but the pacing problem do emerge first and foremost in the digitally excluded. So those who are lying on the one side of the digital divide. So this is a 2021 report on the digital divide in Korea implemented by the Ministry of Science and Technology and NIA. And you can see that actually, while the infrastructure is very much developed in Korea, the digital divide in Korea is also very big. And so when it comes to accessibility, Korea is recording a high score, but when it comes to capacity building and the usability of the technology, Korea is lagging behind, particularly in the elderly. And so I think that means that we have to pay attention to the digital divide, especially in regard to the elderly. But that also means that we need a more inclusive governance. And so that this kind of inclusivity is not just about the vulnerable classes, but also about needing the participation of various stakeholders. So first of all, let's talk about the judicial governance. We have the typical bureaucracy as mentioned by Max Weaver. So this is a very modern kind of administrative system. And so you have well-trained civil servants, and it's a very hierarchical, very vertical kind of decision-making process, top to bottom kind of decision-making process. But then in the 80s and 90s, in the Anglo-Saxon world, you have what we call the neoliberal policies. And so the new public management theory came about based on the business management theories. And so the citizens give more authority to the government, and they are sort of like the customers consuming the administrative services. And so the customer satisfaction becomes important, and efficiency on the part of administration has also become important, but they are still very much supply-side policies. But then in the 2000s, in the late 2000s, and especially after 2008, during the Obama administration, the open government partnership was forged based on the values of transparency, participation, and collaboration. And we even had a summit in Korea. So many governments started to participate. But there are two things lacking in this initiative. So the technology actually provides a variety of different opportunities, but it did not bring about sufficient amount of change in the government administration organization. And so the culture of the government administrative structure was still very much outdated and centered on service provision. So we dream about a day when civil servants will work like civil hackers and the government works like a startup. But I think in this regard, we still have a long way to go. But then there was a really good example. Do you remember in the beginning of the pandemic, you remember that we faced a lack of face masks. And so some citizens created an app that would show on the map where you can buy the face masks. So it has a face mask map and a COVID-19 map. So we did an analysis in our research center, and we were able to find that this kind of collaboration network between various stakeholders actually improved the public sector's decision making, so it helps government decision making process greatly. And so this kind of private partnership with the public sector was very short-lived. It was only for about 15 days, but I thought it was a very good example that showed the kind of partnership and collaboration. And so anyway, government innovation requires the solidarity with the international community because the digital connectivity crosses borders. Actually, the Act on the Digital Inclusivity is being discussed at the National Assembly in Korea. It's been about 2 years. The law itself is quite important, but we also need to be able to look at the concept of inclusivity as something that regulates the data as something that can be enjoyed by everyone as a universal right. And so I think on one hand, we need the physical digital infrastructure, but we also need the educational infrastructure. And through the technological analytics and methodologies, the government services should not just be unilateral, but the citizens also have to be able to participate in the decision-making process. And but the citizens cannot participate in everything, so I think very well-rounded and multidimensional partnerships are very important. And so issues like platform liability and EU frameworks and UN frameworks are also emerging, especially in the artificial intelligence arena. And so these kind of international rule-setting efforts are being made, but we still have a long way to go. Anyway, technology cannot be just transplanted independently of society. So we call this a science, technology, and society system. So we have to have social institutions to maximize the probability of the social acceptance of their innovations. And so the digital technology is a mediator for a variety of different socioeconomic values to be created. So using public data, for example, the traffic system can be complemented. Many civic hackers play a role to create many industrial values. The satellite images can be used for poverty reduction and also for social welfare, and through the natural language processing, we can use the technology to analyze the statements made by politicians, and also government platforms and public data can become the basis for new forms of public-private partnerships. And I think they will be able to trigger new changes for a new era. And so these small efforts may culminate to bring about a more inclusive and globally sustainable and digital freedoms. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Professor Kyung-Yeol Park. So Professor Park has talked about how to bring about a successful digital transformation. We need many stakeholders to come up with a multi-dimensional and multi-angled collaboration in forging a digital governance framework. So let's go on to the last presentation for session number 1. So I'd like to now invite Professor So-Young Kim. She's also the director of the Korea Policy Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution at KAIST. Let's welcome her with a big round of applause.
Good morning, I'm So-Young Kim. We're having a very important forum between KAIST and NYU. This is the first forum since our partnership has been formed. We had a previous forum offline in New York, and this is our second forum taking place in Seoul. It's a great honor for me to be invited here. I'm a little bit nervous right now. I also have very strong friendship with today's speakers, especially Professor Liao. In March in Sweden, we met, right? And in Switzerland, sorry. We had a discussion there on a similar topic. And with World Bank Group, Professor Kyung-Yeol Park and also our own center are seeking for cooperation opportunities. So let me get started. Korea is a very innovative country, which is a very well-known fact. Bloomberg Innovation Index, which is a preferred source of statistics of Korean government officers, because on this index, Korea always ranks number one. This is from an international organization, right? And Korea also ranks number one among all the East Asian countries. So on many of the indicators and indexes, Korea is being placed as not probably one of the most happiest countries, but it's being recognized as one of the most innovative countries in the world. And especially in terms of digital government or digital governance, Korea also ranks number one. The Ministry of the Interior and Safety is collecting information on this. And if you look at the OECD Digital Information Index, Korea always ranks number one. And in the OECD Digital Governance Index, we also ranked number one last year. We used to be placed in the fourth or fifth place, but last year we improved a lot. But this hasn't happened overnight. It took a lot of time for Korea to become this prominent country. In 2001, Act of E-Government was passed. It was about 20 years ago, right? So E-Government Act was passed in Korea, which started and launched public services such as home tax system. When I was having my year off in the United States, I was filing tax returns in the United States. I forgot everything about tax returns, how I would do that in the United States, but I still felt that, it was so inconvenient to file a tax return in the United States. But in Korea, for a busy professor like me, it was very easy to file a return in Korea by using an e-tax system. So the goal of providing e-service to South Korean citizens, our final goal is to build an intelligent digital system, which was one of the most important pledges during the presidential election last time. And both the ruling and opposition parties presented this type of pledge, which include building a digital governance system. President Yoon, who was the candidate last year, he also emphasized the importance of digital government, digital platform government. So he came up with the idea of digital platform government. The Fourth Industrial Revolution was a hot topic a few years ago. Then President Yoon came up with this idea of digital platform government. So everybody is working so hard to understand the concept of digital platform government. And there was a task force in the transition committee working on the concept of digital platform government. And July this year, digital platform Government Act was passed, and just 2 months ago, the Digital Platform Government Presidential Committee was launched, which included 6 subcommittees, one of which is to change the way of working. So there is this subcommittee specifically working on the way of work, how to change the way we work. Digital platform government, what is it? And what does the Digital Platform Government Committee does? As a citizen myself, which was this was already touched upon by Professor Park. When we go online, and if we try to use digital service from the private sector, you receive a lot of advertisements. You feel that the internet knows me better than myself, but I sometimes get the feeling that how could government know such the government doesn't really understand the way I live. The government doesn't understand the citizens. How come the government doesn't understand what I do or what I am? But it seems like all the private sector services have such a good understanding of my life. So there was a big contrast. I met with an executive from IBM, and there's 3 types of data, he said. There are so many data experts here today, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. There are 3 types of data. So the first type is the free data, which has the lowest value, and the second type is the data that can be purchased because it has some value. And the third type, which is the most important, the most valuable, is data that is beyond purchase, that you cannot purchase with money, which is protected by corporations because you cannot buy such data with your money. So data of that kind is very important. When we say opening public data, it's not taking place really well because of course, public data is very much open in Korea, but if you look at the usability, it's only 50%. 50% of the public data is being actively used. So on the index and indicators, Korea is performing very well, but if you look at the actual usage of public data, we lag pretty much behind. I studied politics, so I think of this from the governance perspective. So I come up with some questions. The public sector digital platforms have been built, and still we were experiencing some inconveniences. Then digital platform government must go beyond that, and it has to take one step further. But what will the digital platform government different from all the digital services that we have been getting from the government? What will make it different from the existing e-government services? Digital platform government, when it first came out, well, I went to Jeju Island a couple of days ago, and I had a discussion with some of the public officials from all the ministries, and we had a discussion on this concept. But they said that from the Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Welfare, all of them have their own online services, and they have been asked to connect their services but they had no idea how to do that. Then, because they didn't know who should take which responsibilities and which roles in connecting their services. So what I'm trying to show you here is that when the private sector is asked to do something like that, like connecting their services, it would take place so swiftly and quickly. But when it comes to the government, there is a ministry who is in charge of connecting all the public services, but it's not actively playing its role. So what we talk about, how we're going to change the way we work, which is one area that the Presidential Committee on Digital Platform Government is working on. So by the end of the current administration, we should be able to say that we have achieved great change. So when we talk about changing the way we work, it's not just about technological advances, but rather we need to really find a way to work together with other actors. This is from a New York Times story. There was a big event in Korea which is related to digital governance. So the Kakao service went down a while ago. 9 out of 10 Korean citizens used this service, and the service went down. So it created a huge uproar in Korea. So why did this happen? Does that mean that all the private sector companies should be public companies or state-owned companies? And if you look at the digital competitiveness, Korea is ranking very high. But just because there were some digital accidents, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to make all of the private companies and turn them into publicly owned companies. So we're not saying that we have to change what the private sector companies are doing, but we have to make sure that we find a way to work with the private sector, not jeopardizing what they are doing and not hampering the creativity of the private sector. But we need to find a way to build on the creativity of the private sector. So in 5 years' time, I hope that we will be able to build a good example of digital platform government. Thank you.
예, 김소영 센터장님 감사합니다. 예, 김소영 센터장님이
Professor Kim, thank you very much for your presentation. So she talked about how the current Korean government is going about in order to build a digital platform government. So she showed us 8 slides, but she went on she gave us a very good presentation, so it's very, very impressive. So with that, we would like to conclude our first session, and we will go on to our second session. We will make some arrangement on the stage for the second session.
Can you go to the stage? Yeah. So 일단 그 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 두 번째 세션은 오늘 첫 번째
As I've said before, the second session, we will have a panel discussion with our speakers, and the moderator or chair will be Dong-man Lee, who is the dean of our engineering school.
So while we get the stage prepared, I'd just like to make some housekeeping announcements. So in session number 2, we're going to have a panel discussion. Then after session 2, we're going to have a luncheon. And so it's going to take us about 15 minutes to get things arranged for lunch. So after session 2, please exit the hall for a few minutes, about 15 minutes. And when we're all set for lunch, we'll invite you back in. So Professor Lee, if you're ready, please go ahead. Hello, everyone. So thank you for being here with us despite the early hours of the day. The presidents have already thanked us, but I would also like to express my gratitude for putting this forum together in a very short notice. I'd also like to thank the speakers who have traveled a long distance to come here. And also there are people who are based in Seoul, but nonetheless, I know that you're really busy with your schedule, so I'd like to thank you for being here. So you may have been a little bit surprised. So you have an engineering professor. Actually, not for all of them are engineers or engineering professors. You have social scientists, people working in the humanities, but I'm an engineering professor and I'm sitting here as a moderator. But just to talk a little bit about my experience, I'm not sure if I can just say this here, but you can consider that I am not completely not knowledgeable about these issues. For about the past 25 years, I've been working on the issue of the internet governance. And so I am also chairing the Korea Internet Governance Forum. Together with Professor So-Young Kim, and as Professor Park had said, we have what we call the Open Data Forum. I think it's about 7 years old now. So it's a forum to discuss how to make better use of the public data generated by the public sector. So it's a forum that discusses these issues. So I've been a founding member from the beginning. So And I am also involved in internet-based research. I look into the issue of how technology can become fair and equitable and also be used freely by everyone. So those are my concerns, which means that today's forum is a very meaningful venue for me. So you know all four of them. But let me just summarize little parts of what the four presenters have said, and then we'll go on to the panel discussion. So first, we had a presentation from Professor Matthew Liao. You've talked about how the exponential growth of AI technology has also led to a variety of different issues related to human rights violations and also ethical issues. And so you have talked about robust. We don't really have a correct word for it in Korea, but anyway, you have talked about the need for a robust framework. So of course, technological development is very important, but we also have to deal with a variety of different issues like privacy violations. But I think we also have to think about beyond those just human rights into the structural issues of what to do when systems fail. And then we had a presentation from Mr. Jason Alford. You have talked about data for a better life, but I think ultimately what we need to think about are equity, trust, and value. And so we need a balancing between the three values. So I think that was the essence of Mr. Alford's presentation, and is something that we really need to contemplate going forward. And then Professor Park also made a very interesting presentation. What I found was quite impressive was that, of course, many people think about Korea as a pioneer in internet technology. But why were we able to reap innovation from all that? Was because internet is like a generally applied technology. The digital technology, when we talk about the digital divide, was more about access, just about access to technology. But nowadays, it just goes beyond accessibility. It's how it exerts influence in all areas of society. So that also leads us to the issues of equity and trust. And so a new type of governance structure needs to be set up, according to Professor Park. And then Professor Kim continued from that. So she's talked about the responsibility and the role that the incumbent government of Korea has to make. So from the beginning of the government, it talked about the digital platform government. So that brought me to think about 2 decades ago. So we've been talking about the open government, digital government, and the Ministry of Interior was using these concepts. So then I thought, is the digital platform government not the same thing? So anyway, I think there are some important aspects of the platform that Professor Kim had talked about, and my understanding is that the key word was connectivity. So we need connectivity within the government. So personally, I've been using a lot of public data in my research, and I have faced a situation where you have all these websites about open government data, public data, and so the Seoul Metropolitan Government has its own website. The Ministry of Land and Transport has its own website for open government data. So you have all these data, but the problem is that they're not machine readable, and so you can't really feed them for machine learning. If you want to do so, you have to convert those files and data, and a lot of it is hidden. And so the students are asked to find a certain data, and they always say that they can't find it. So what happens is that they eventually get the phone number of the public servant in charge in a particular ministry, so we call them up and we ask them, and then we eventually get an Excel file. It's like a list of all the documents that they have. And then on the page 25, on the 3rd line, you might be able to find the document that you need. So basically, the data is disclosed, but if you want to actually access that document or that data, you have to go through so many different processes and make too much effort. Still, the Ministry of Interior in the previous government, I can't remember exactly, but had formed a committee and is leading the committee and had created a forum for discussion between various stakeholders. But so the Ministry of Interior is supposed to play the central role, but it's really difficult for the ministry to do so because the information or the data is not being properly shared between the ministries. The formats are different, etc. And so what are we going to do about the connectivity within the government? So if we listen to 4 presentations, there's one commonality that I can find, and that is in order to be able to better communicate, we have to be able to make good use of the data, but it's not just the government alone. It's not just the business or just the individual. It can't be left to the effort of just one party. It really depends on the collaboration of amongst the various stakeholders in the parties and how to forge a governance structure that is commensurate to that kind of collaboration. So having said that, I would like to now give 3 questions to the panelists. So can you put those on screen? So the first question is, who are the main stakeholders for the digital governance? So that's the first question I gave you. The second question, so what are the roles and responsibilities of each of the stakeholders? Then the third question is that we talk about AI and data, and we also talk about the government structure. What would be the correct, appropriate structure for digital governance? And there have been so many different types of governance structures, and if you were to come up with a particular digital governance structure, how is it similar to the existing ones, or how is it different from the similar ones, existing ones? So yes, we have sufficient time, so which is why I was a little bit long in my introduction. So anyway, yes, we have until nearly 12 o'clock for the panel discussion. So before we go on to the panelists, well, I think half the time you can listen to the panelists, but then we can also entertain some questions from the floor. So we look forward to lots of questions from the floor. So with that, so should we just do it in the order that we are sitting in? Or we do it in the order of the presentations. So at first, I'd like to give the mic to Professor Liao, then to Mr. Alford, then Professor Park, then Professor Kim. So yeah, we're not seated in that order, so it's a little bit confusing. So please just remember which order you made your presentations in, and then you can answer in that same order. So Professor Liao, I'm just going to give you a minute or 2 minutes first.
Great. Thank you, Dean Lee, for that introduction. So just on the question of, so the first question is, who are the main stakeholders for digital governance? My view is that everybody, so I take a human rights perspective, I think everyone has a stake in this, in digital governance, because it's going to affect all of our lives. And so you want to make sure that this, your privacy is not being undermined, the technology is actually working to promote your well-being, the well-being of your loved ones. What are the roles and the responsibilities? What I mean by human rights, so in addition to everybody, what that also means is that governments, companies, individual researchers, they all have to kind of pay attention to what's going on. It's not just sort of, I'm just doing my job, right? They have to understand the ramifications of their, when they're producing a technology, what that means for the greater society. So just to give an example, facial recognition technologies that I mentioned in my talk, Google had faced this problem. There's some issue about how some governments might wanted to militarize and use that technology for military purposes. And a bunch of Google researchers and sort of people who worked at Google actually came and said, we're not going to be involved in that project, because they were really worried about how it might be used for bad purposes. And so that's Project Maven. And that kind of shows sort of the stakeholdership, that we're all involved and we all got to take responsibility. What would a right structure for digital governance be? There are different ways of thinking about this. So, one of the things I said in my talk was we need one of the biggest issues with digital governance is we need to have a lot of data, right? And that means collecting data and how to use it properly. I was at a meeting at a Google Bioethics Summit 2 weeks ago, where all the conversation was about how we can collect data in an ethical kind of way. Right. And one way to do about it, so I'm a philosopher and a bioethicist. And in medical ethics, there's actually already a structure. It's called the IRB, the International Research Review Board, Institutional Review Board. And what that does is that it sort of, even before you start your project, you go through an IRB to vet your project to make sure that this is going to be done in an ethical way. And what's happening right now with companies right now is that they start first, they develop these technologies, they get these data, and they're really far along, and then they're thinking about the ethics. And that's already too late, because by that time you've invested millions, maybe even billions of dollars into the technology. And so it's much better. And then, it's very hard that time to say, no, this is not that ethical, you really should change it. It's much better to be proactive, to have some sort of IRB system where you set it up to kind of review these projects, whether internally or externally. And we have that governance structure exists already. We use that in healthcare. Right, sort of with respect to genomic data, with respect to a lot of sensitive data, healthcare data, we already know how to do that. And I think similar parallel governance structure can be set up with respect to digital data. Thanks.
Thank you very much. 우리말로 해야지. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. I should be speaking in Korean, right? Alfred, please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, in my presentation, to the first question, I listed the stakeholders as individuals, and along with civil society and academics, government in the middle, and international organisations and private businesses. So those three stakeholders. But I think if you push me to say who's the main stakeholder, I think I'd agree with Professor Lau that I'd say it's everyone. Which is very broad, but by everyone, what I mean is it's people. It's really the individuals that have to be the centre of the governance framework, because I think that they're the ones that stand to benefit if we're able to come up with a system of digital governance that works well, and they're also the ones that stand to lose if we make mistakes in our system of digital governance. So I think the other two parts of the framework that I've set out need to be, in some sense, subsidiary to that need for the main stakeholder to be everyone, every person. So then within that, government, of course, has that traditional role of regulation and protection of the population, compliance, those types of things. But we would argue that the private sector should also take into account the same elements of a social contract that I put out. So those considerations of value, equity, and trust. And I think, Professor Lau, you're saying a quite similar thing, that they do need to take account of that. And as I said, I think that could also be good for business in a lot of cases. It's not just a costly thing to do. What are the roles and responsibilities? Well, I think I've just gone over that as well. I think, government ultimately is the regulator and does need to be the representation of the people in terms of thinking about regulatory systems for digital governance, but everyone has a responsibility to the extent possible. The last question, what would be a right structure for digital governance? That's what I find the really tough question. Like I said, I think every country has is going to come up with a different structure that reflects local norms, local cultures, local institutions. World Bank, we've set out some elements that we think should be taken into consideration in that system of digital governance. If you drill down, I'm sure the World Bank is also telling countries what we think they should do because we like telling people what to do. But really that has to come out of country systems. And I think, some simple examples that show that. Professor Park gave us the example of the app for finding face masks in Korea, an app to help citizens comply better with government regulations on masking works in Korea. Does it work in the US or Australia? Maybe not so well. And another example is in Australia when we first started collecting electronic tax returns. You spoke about electronic tax returns. The system that we set up assumed that people would try to cheat the government. So we asked a lot of questions to try to get data out of people to find out if they were trying to cheat us. But then we had a new tax commissioner come in and say, well, why don't we approach this from the point of view that we assume taxpayers want to comply with our tax law and want to do that as quickly and easily as possible. And then you come up with a very different system for data collection where you don't need to be as intensive in the questions you ask people and the invasion of privacy that you make from them. And that worked quite well for us. But in a different cultural or country context, that may not work. So that would be my answer. Thank you.
고맙습니다. 알포 대표님. 다음은 박경렬 교수님.
Thank you very much. Professor Park, please go ahead.
감사합니다.
Yes, thank you. So, we have heard from the previous speakers, and they've already mentioned some important aspects, so I'll just try not to repeat what they've said. So regarding the stakeholders, if you look at climate change and sustainable development, there has also been some discussion about how we're going to think about the stakeholders. And we also have to include the future generations who are not yet born yet, who will be impacted by the decisions that we make today. So when it comes to digital transformation also, I think everyone here in the room went from the analog world to the digital world, but you have the new generation. So I sometimes I use apps like Zepeto just to understand and do research, and sometimes I meet elementary school children using Zepeto and I can't understand anything what they're saying. And so we need to be able to accommodate the future generations as our stakeholder. So that's just one thing that I wanted to point out. Professor Lee talked about his experience. The format of the documents and the data has to be machine readable. Why is it so difficult for the government open data to actually be implemented? Because inaction is also action. So it could be a passive kind of action. So maybe people are still not very proactive about disclosing all the data. So it's really difficult from approach that from the normative perspective. So civil servants are really busy, which means that we also need to incentivize them to disclose more data. That also brings us to the leadership. So Mapping for Result was another project implemented by World Bank, and I think it was in 2010. You had an open data policy, and so it was very pioneering work. About 30,000 points where World Bank works were logged, and so it was mapped, and so it was a really good project. But it was just half successful because disclosing the data requires a lot of money and people and a lot of effort. And so we also have to know what kind of data is necessary. We have to think of it from the demand side as well, and then go in different stages to disclose what is actually needed. In one of my slides, I talked about integration. So we need integration within the government, but there are two sides to this. On one hand, you have the systematic or systemic integration, interoperability. So because many ministries have all using different systems. So you have the ODA, and 16 ministries are working with ODA, and so are the local governments, but there is no integrated system that allows for sharing of information between all of these agencies. And then you have the employment data. Employment data is important not just for the Labor Ministry, but also for the Education Ministry and other ministries as well. And so we also need integration with, for example, the insurance data. So that also requires public-private partnership. So we have to look at the governance structure from this kind of perspective. Thank you very much. Last but not least, Professor Kim.
Yes, in connection to that, digital platform governance or digital governance, of course, everybody is the main stakeholder, but there are primary and secondary stakeholders, I think. For example, digital platform government, when it comes to that, the first stakeholder will be the government, of course, and the public servants working at the government. But the problem is that with regard to the third question, what should be the right structure for digital governance? I think it's a matter of incentives or incentivizing people. Not just the data governance, but other subjects require cooperation between ministries and between governments. And that's the most challenging aspect of that, because not just the government, but also us, collaboration is very challenging because there are not the right incentives for them to act. For example, at Microsoft a while ago, when they were evaluating people, I don't know, I don't remember the exact name of it, but there was a criteria which assessed people as to how much help that they received. So instead of assessing how much help they provided to others, people were assessed against the criteria of how much help they actually were given. So when we tackle climate change, the pandemic, digital transformation, and other many challenges that humanity is faced with, I don't think that there is a single ministry that should be in charge of all the different challenges. So how should ministries work together? And this is one thing that the current government has to think a lot about. So, as I said earlier, the ministries need to perform well with their own programs. And most of the programs these days are taking place horizontally with the participation of many different ministries. So I believe that the government has to change itself so that the programs are executed horizontally. If this goes well, then as we have seen in the case of the Apollo project in the United States, which was a good example of a horizontal program, was very successful. I don't think it was a technological project, but I think that we should see it as an example of a collaboration, horizontal program. Digital governance is the same. So it's not just the responsibility of the Ministry of the Interior and maybe the technology side that should be in charge of the Ministry of Science and Technology. So these type of silo type of working style will not work for our future. So, of course, we need to come up with a clear definition of roles and responsibilities, but we have to be clear about where we can get the right help from whom. Thank you very much. So we've listened to the comments from our four speakers. The first and second question, I think we've reached a consensus. As we have listened to the two presidents, President Lee from KAIST said that digital data transcends borders and time, and it includes all the stakeholders, and it has to build a digital ecosystem. And President Hamilton also said that a free flow of information is key, and therefore free flow of people and ideas is very important. So the stakeholders, when it comes to stakeholders, I believe that we have reached pretty much a consensus as to the roles and responsibilities of the stakeholders. But I would like to present a little bit of challenging question, which is related to question number 3, because I think that we have some different opinions about question number 3. So let me share my ideas. Globally, we say multilateral cooperation. So if you look at UN, which is a good example of a multilateral cooperation where things are decided by the discussion from member countries, and it is delivered to the member countries and executed. So most of the time this happens in order to solve international issues. So mostly it's led by governments and countries. But when we talk about digital related issues, what's most important? It doesn't recognize national borders. So everything is cross borders. And in the private sector, the digital technology first was developed by the private sector. So it's not really designed for the works of the government originally. So internet governance, the key to that is the multi-stakeholder, the collaboration between multi-stakeholders. So why does it become shaky? Because recently, with the development of digital technology, many social issues are arising. For example, in Korea, there was a very serious cybercrime related to drug trafficking. And Telegram is often been taken advantage of by criminals online. Then the government intervention becomes very important, and it doesn't affect just one country, but many countries across borders. So, multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism. How should we take a balance between these two concepts? Our four speakers and all talked about this, and Professor Kim also talked about this. So communication between stakeholders and taking a balance between stakeholders is necessary. And what is the right structure for that? Because it's not just the private sector, the government, or the individual's responsibilities. We need to work together. Professor Park also said that when we were solving COVID-19 pandemic, the initiative was launched by the individual citizens, and the private sector supported, and the government also participated. And that is why we were able to respond to the pandemic very early on. So communication and balancing between the stakeholders was key, I believe. So multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism. So how should we take the balance between these two? So what do you think? Professor Liao, could you please share your ideas?
Oh, that's such a great question and such a complex question. I think we can look to some analogies. Back in the 2000s, I was working on embryonic stem cell research. And there were a lot of, we face similar issues because it turns out that around the world, different countries have different rules around embryonic stem cell research. Some countries are more restrictive, like Italy, Germany. Other countries are more liberal, so like the US and so on and so forth. I think Korea was one of the pioneers in sort of embryonic stem research, with sort of induced pluripotent stem cells, IPCs. So a lot of people got together. So I was part of this group called the Hingston Group, where there are international researchers got together, and we put out a statement of some of the best practices about surrounding stem cell research. And that we were also trying to come up with thinking about, this area needs to be regulated. It needs to have some sort of structure. So at that time, the researchers, it included researchers, academic deans, but also journals. We had Nature and Science were sort of part of the stakeholders. So we invited like as many people, like sort of the stakeholders to the group, and we came up with a consensus statement about how to govern that. And that wasn't a perfect process. And now, of course, that document then played a role in sort of shaping some of the policies, for example, in the US. But I think it's very complicated. You can come at it from different levels. In the case of embryonic stem cell research, it was a bunch of people who thought that it was important to come together and to start out putting statements because that's kind of unregulated. Just to give a more recent analogy, so think of lethal autonomous weapons. A bunch of researchers in the field thought that this technology is really dangerous and we really should ban lethal autonomous weapons. We shouldn't really allow that in the wild. And so a bunch of researchers and stakeholders also got together and put out a statement. And they gave that statement to the UN, and there are a lot of discussions right now. So that's sort of like mid-level approach to the governance. You can have a more top-down approach. It's sort of driven by maybe the UN or some sort of global organization. And you can have a more bottom-up approach where it's driven by sort of citizens and things like that. And so I think it depends on the issue. But at the end of the day, I think the first thing to recognize is still at the individual level. Is this something that we need to be worried about? And if we are, then I think we have a collective responsibility to work with people to find the right people who are going to be sort of the right stakeholders to come up with the right governance structure. So.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah. It's a great question and a tough one. I think, I was a public servant for a long time. So, thinking of governance, I think of the government's role in governance. I'm interested in Director Kim's answer to this question as well. But I think it's very hard for government to stay ahead in a field like this. Public servants, it's very hard for public servants to be on the cutting edge of digital technologies. It's hard for them to know exactly what problems will arise. So where does that lead you to? It means, well, firstly, to keep up, you're very reliant on, say, researchers, academics, institutions like KAIST to work with government to help keep government on the cutting edge of what the issues are and what needs to be looked at. You can have some capacity for this within government, but it is difficult to sustain it. And I think it also leads you to a system of governance that you will want to set out some principles, even though the specifics of how you operationalise those principles will depend on the exact issues and problems that come up as you go. So you think of something like, the rise of social media where individual people suddenly saw great value in accessing these social media and sharing information, and it moved so quickly. It's very hard for government to keep up with that and to have anticipated that. Or corporations and businesses that are working with a profit motive, they'll then have a system of incentives that causes them to move in a particular direction that, again, for public service might be hard to predict. So you need to have ways to, principles that you think should be observed, but then the specifics you need to try to keep up with as they happen. With multi-stakeholders, as I said in my presentation, we think there's great value in sharing of information and cooperation, and you can really magnify the benefits if governments and businesses and individuals are working together to share data. But it also does magnify the risk points and makes the governance issues more complicated, so it's something that you need to keep in mind. On multilateralism, a country like Korea or indeed Australia, sort of a middle to big, larger country, but with much bigger countries around. We have a lot of interest in systems of regulation that establish international norms and make the operating environment of the world more predictable for us. So I think we have a great interest in multilateralism. But again, we need to think about how we agree and come up with those organising principles that help us think about what the governance framework would look like. Professor Lau quite a few times has mentioned human rights. That's one point we can start from to come up with those principles that we think are important in multilateralism. Maybe there are other ways as well, but these are incredibly complicated issues. I mean, the simple example of Korea trying to establish a system of digital governance, but what if the data is held in another jurisdiction? So an immediate simple problem that, requires some level of international cooperation if you were to establish, norms that can apply even in your own jurisdiction. So I haven't really answered the question because it is incredibly complicated.
박 교수님.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you.
멀티-스테이크홀더
So, governance structure based on multi-stakeholderism, well, that's not going to be very easy. So, from a policy perspective,
정책은 특히 과학기술 분야에서는
especially in the science and technology, there are enabling or constraints. So you have the R&D, you have the legislations, you have the IPR. So those are some of the enablers. But then there are also constraints. For example, regulation on the data platform.
사실은 좀 더 본질적인 문제는
But more fundamentally, there are obstacles to collaboration, and they usually come from the rigidity or in silos, whether it be on the individual level or the organizational level. So you have rather a fixed kind of initiatives that are not really flexible, so they hinder collaboration.
저는 조금 우리가 좀 엉뚱한 생각을 좀 해본다면
So I'm going to approach it from a slightly silly perspective. So there are many conflicts regarding technology.
경직성에서 저는 개인적으로 오는 것 같습니다.
And I think that comes from the dichotomy between the sciences and engineering versus the humanities and social sciences. So there's this kind of dichotomy in Korea. And I was a little bit frustrated myself when I was a student. Things have changed somewhat, but how have we developed, or how much have we developed during the last 20 years? So people have these disciplines, and you have the private sector, the public sector, and we also talked about the international norm setting, but we also have
그런 다양한 문화적인 관점에서도
different international norms, and so there are a variety of different angles where you can participate from. So there are techno-nationalist kind of perspective, which can be important in some ways for national strategies, but in the process of the global norm setting, we do see some decoupling phenomena. And so we need a space for many scientists to be able to participate in the global norm setting, but unfortunately that space is still decreasing actually. And so it's not an easy to be able to forge that kind of structure. So there is a lot of competition over technology, but I think we still have to open some space.
Yes. I'm in charge of R&D policy, but originally my academic identity belongs to policies. Unlike science and technology, it is very difficult to find a pattern in policy, but there are some patterns that are easy to follow. One is that there was no between democracies, and secondly, the size of government increased after the Second World War. But in the 1990s, with the privatization taking place very rapidly, and with the integration of the economy, there was some concern that the government was actually decreasing in size. So, however, it didn't really take place. The government size of it is keep on increasing. But there's a fundamental problem, which is, if you look at the private sector, it's moving very fast. It's moving ahead of the government. And starting from the 1990s, the R&D budget of the private sector is way higher than the government. Then what should be the role of the government? That's the question that we often encounter. What should be the roles of the government? The government is no longer smarter than the private sector as before. Korea and Latin America until the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, both areas, the government used to work top down, and there were a lot of corruption in the government. And when we provide ODA, we criticize the low developed countries. But back then, the Korean government was the same. Korean government was very slow. We used to have so-called Korean time. And but we still criticize the low developed economy because we have this concept. Of course, we went through dictatorships, but in the developed countries, they still lacked understanding of what's needed for the private sector. But what was different for Korea was that we also had to go through a dictatorship and all the challenges, which is the similar path of the low developed countries. But the government took the initiative and they found a way to work with the private sector. When we were doing the policy financing, we used to be very top-down, but we had a very embedded policy approach. But it's very challenging to exercise the embedded policy approach because of the many challenges faced by public servants and the government, on top of the fast-paced technological development. So as the primary stakeholder, the government, the digital platform government, with regard to this initiative, the primary stakeholder would be the public servants. And I would like to emphasize that there is a very great challenge that the public servants are faced with today.
So, before I give the mic to the floor, I just wanted to actually ask another question. And I think Professor Kim actually led me naturally to that question. Anyway, the four of you gave some very insightful answers. But the main thing is that all stakeholders have to have mutual respect. I think that's ultimately, that's the core. So if you don't have the respect, everything is going to be just top down. But then multi-stakeholderism is actually bottom up. And it's also about respecting one another's role, enabling collaboration between the multi-stakeholders. So I think that kind of challenge is the one that we face now. So we still have about 7 to 8 minutes, and then I think we can entertain some questions from the floor.
I like a question for
우리말로 해주시면 좋겠어요.
You can actually just talk in Korean.
여기 번역이 되니까.
Have interpretation.
Because he speaks English, I want to ask him English.
유튜브로 중계가 되거든요. 그래서 그래요.
We actually have YouTube streaming. That's why I'm asking you to just speak in
그러면
Korean.
한국말로 하겠습니다.
Okay, so I'll just speak in Korean then. So I'm from KAIST. My name is Kim Bo-won, and so I would just like to ask a question about the global perspective. So a while ago, we used to think that one day, due to the technological progress, the world is going to become more freer, more abundant, have a stronger democracy. But looking back, you see around the world many different issues, and actually those hopes did not really realize. For example, China has the AI technology and they can use it to surveillance and persecute their nationals. And so I thought, why do Chinese tolerate their government doing so? Why are the Chinese people not resisting their government? The surprising thing is that a while ago, Mr. Xi Jinping had his term extended, and we think that he's a leader, and we would think that they are much more insightful, but then they are also really in line with the party. So this goes beyond the individual ethics. On the state level, all states have their historical experience, and it's a matter of survival for them. So whether it be Russia or China, it's not just a matter of right or wrong from the individual ethics. There's a national psyche, because it's about national survival. And there's a bias towards this kind of idea of national survival. So in these countries, well, in other countries, there'll be more freedom, and the technology is used for freedom, but in these countries, it's used for other purposes. So it goes beyond individual ethics, but it's actually related to the historical experience and the national ethos or national sentiment, and so we have to take that take that into consideration. So perhaps I'd like to ask Professor Liao, what do you think about this kind of perspective, and what your take is on this?
Oh, thank you for that really insightful comment. I think I completely agree with you that you have to take into account the cultural perspective. I think especially when Dean Lee was talking about how human rights just establishes the responsibilities, but we also need the structure. And part of the structure is going to be culturally based. And there are different cultures and different governments. They're going to have different ideas and different attitudes about how to implement those type of different policies. But I think what I like, so I completely agree with you. What I like about the human rights perspective is that it gives us a sort of a extra legal perspective to look at the policy. So is it okay to just do this facial recognition mass surveillance on everybody? You might think it's not that desirable. So it sort of goes beyond what we need to maintain law and order, and that can have perverse effects on governments and on sort of the way citizens can interact with us in a free, with each other in a freely kind of way. And so I think that there are people who are, when people think about technologies, there are people who are techno-optimists. They think that, look, all these new technologies, they're just going to make the world so much better, and we should just bring them all in, right? And then there are also techno-pessimists. So there are people who think, every new technology, this is going to destroy humanity. It's going to be really bad. We shouldn't bring anything in. There are also those people. I'm more of a techno-realist. So I think technologies, they're up to us and up to the society, up to us to decide how we want to bring it about and whether and which way we want to bring it about. So if we can use it for good purposes, but they can also be used for very bad purposes. And we've seen that from time again. So airplanes can be really good, but they can also be used to bomb countries. And so it's kind of up to us to decide which path we want to take. And the sad thing, but also the exciting thing, is that each generation will have to re-answer that question for itself. And that's why politics is so messy, because it's not something that you do it once, then it's done. You have it. You have your utopia. It turns out that you have to continually renew that conversation, and that's why the communication with citizens become very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 감사합니다. 시간상 저희가
So due to time constraints, we'll just have to take one more question, and then we'll have to wrap up the session.
Thank you very much. So my name is Martin Ziegler. I'm from KAIST. And if you recall, democracy as a form of inclusive governments was introduced 2,500 years ago in Athens. Before that, usually the king was the single governor and made decisions by himself. But even in Athens, this democracy was limited to citizens, to male citizens, which were just a few hundreds. It excluded women, excluded peasants, it excluded slaves. Since then, we have come a long way in becoming even more inclusive with respect to democracy. For example, I, as a foreigner, was able to vote in local elections recently here in Daejeon. But still, the paradox about democracy is that it's very hard for people in power to relinquish power. Right? For example, US president had a hard time accepting a loss in the election. Then there's gerrymandering. And now we're proceeding to digital governments, which is again a huge opportunity to further increase participation and inclusion in democratic governance, kind of like world governance. But again, we're faced with realization that the rules for digital governments are being discussed and made by a small elite, and that's us here, right? I don't see any peasants from a third world country participating in this discussion. So, and also there's the big global companies like Google and Microsoft who have a strong incentive in still maintaining a grip on the power of the data and maybe introducing backdoors or exceptions. So my question is, how can we solve that paradox that those who create the rules for governments should also make sure that these rules, that they relinquish their power from in that way? That's my question. Thank you.
네, 고맙습니다. 누가 질문에 대답 받으시겠어요? 네, 이건 뭐 네, 감사합니다.
네, 그 질문 너무 감사하고요. 우리가
Thank you very much.
2010년 정도에
Back in 2010, there was Arab Spring. Syria, Jordan, Tunisia, and Egypt experienced the Arab Spring, and they were they found out, we find out that techno-optimism is not right. There are many efforts regarding norm setting for digital governance, and most of them are based on technological deterministic views, and we need to make a major revision to that. Are there any speakers who would like to make comments?
Again, a really interesting question. So we've spoken about the opportunity for each generation to reinvent how they approach data and how they use it and digital governance. We also talked about our responsibility to future generations and how we take that into account. And this is a really interesting area because the decisions we make now can affect future people. So you think about the countries where the World Bank works, where there's fast developing countries and systems of governance are changing, and you set up a particular system of digital governance now that you think provides the adequate balance of value versus protection of equity and privacy. But in 10 or 20 years' time, is the system of government going to look the same? And you've collected data and you've stored it in a certain way. Have you adequately provided protections for future generations? So there's this path dependence there. But I don't think this is novel to digital governance issues. You think about gun ownership. So the US has had a certain system of gun ownership. You get to the point now where you have what you have. You have widespread gun ownership. So any changes that you make now have to take that into account. And the decisions that were made in the past have affected where we're up to now. So I think, back to your point on democracy, you have to choose the system of government that you think is the best one for your country and will survive and be sustainable and provide the system of governance into the future that you want. And your ability to prevent technologies or to manage them is quite limited. So it's your system of government that you need to rely on.
네, 하실 말씀 있으세요?
Anybody else would like to comment? Do we all have to say something? No, not necessarily. I'll just be quite short. So, the issue of democracy is really important. And participation is very important, but the quality of participation is also important. Because of technology, anyone can say something, and we have already experienced it. If there's an issue in society, hundreds of thousands of people can say something about it. And so just because it's the majority decision, it's not necessarily always the right decision. It has to be based on the correct information, and people have to know what they want, because some people say something that they don't know they're saying. And so I think the technology and democracy has to connect in a very meaningful way. Professor Liao, you have something to say?
Yes, so I'll say two things. So one is, as Spider-Man said, with greater power comes greater responsibility. So, we need to, if Google has that amount of power, they need to be much more accountable. But in addition to that, Google's made up of individuals. And individuals have to take responsibility. And that was my example about Project Maven, was that a bunch of Google researchers actually stood up and said, we don't like where this was going, and we need to do something about it. And so that's really great. That's a really great example. And then the second point is just that, so Montesquieu talked about check and balances, right? And so we can't be naive and think that people won't use that power for the bad. And so we got to have a check and balance system. And this comes back to Dean Lee's really excellent, really important emphasis on governance, which is we got to have a system there where there's check and balance so that there's a way of checking on the corporation. There are ways of working with the corporation, but also checking on corporation, on institutions that become too powerful where they might be able to use for the bad. Thank you.
감사합니다. 이제
Thank you very much. We're almost up in time, so we have just a couple of minutes left. So I'd just like to ask the panelists, going to give you 30 seconds each for your closing remarks. So we'll start from the end. Professor Kim, because Professor Liao, you have just spoken, so I'll give the mic first to Professor Kim, and then we can take turns. 30 seconds, please.
Well, I have nothing to add to the main contents of our forum. Speaking of democracy, as a person who's majoring in democracy, I've thought of something to talk about. Prometheus, you're well aware, he was punished because of the fire. But even after fire was given, humanity was engaged in fight. So Hermes ordered him do the justice and bring justice and mutual respect to humanity. And Hermes said that maybe why don't we send these two gifts to just one person or to everybody? And Zeus said justice and mutual respect should be distributed to everyone. That's democracy. Decision is not made by one, but by all. In democracy. So mutual respect is the capability that everybody holds, and that's, I think, is the core of democracy.
Great. So I really enjoyed this conversation today, and I think that governance issue is really important and is not going away. It's really great that we're sort of starting. I think a lot of people have been thinking about this, and I just want to emphasize the structure is very important, but structures are made of individuals. We have to become accountable. We have to be cognizant of what can affect us, and what cannot, and then and through that's how we're going to be able to make sure that this technology is used in a responsible and fair kind of way. Thank you.
알포 대표님.
Thank you. Yes, I think the framework I presented of value, trust, equity, I think value and trust are things that people pretty naturally talk about in this context. But I think equity, Professor Ziegler's point that we don't have any, extreme poor in the room here with us making the decisions, and the same in national contexts, we don't always involve the people who don't have equitable access to information, other services in the conversation. Internationally, the same. So everything we do, we need to put a lot of emphasis on that equity component and make sure we're including everyone in the decisions we make.
고맙습니다. 마지막으로 박경일 교수님 말씀해 주세요.
시간 있는 건가요? 네, 오늘 기술과 사회.
So we've been talking about technology and society and the borders. We've been crossing the borders between the two arenas.
이번 포럼을 준비하는
In the process of preparing this forum, I know many people made a lot of effort, so I'd like to thank them, Dr. Lee and Dr. Son. So all of you made a great effort to make this forum possible, so I'd like to thank you. So actually you said what I actually needed to say, and I don't have anything else I need to say, so let's wrap up the session for today. Thank you everyone for being here until the very end. So see you again in the next forum. Bye-bye.
제가 알기로는 사실 여기서 방송이 끝난 걸로 알고 있고 이제 저는 편하게